Well, good afternoon. We would like to welcome everyone for our History for Lunch today. We're delighted to have in-person guests, and we're also delighted if you have joined us online. We have Dr. Glen Bowman with us today from Elizabeth City State University, and his topic today will be Accepting the Inevitability, the Desegregation of Schools in Pasquotank County, 1954 to 1969. Dr. Bowman, we would like to welcome you, and we're going to go ahead and get your PowerPoint started.
All right.
Okay, Dr. Bowman.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Lori. Welcome, audience. Welcome at-home audience. Hopefully, if you're at home, you're, I guess, staying out of the sun, enjoying a hopefully climate-controlled house. It is definitely summer here. I like to start, I'd like to usually start this way, but I like to thank, again, this is kind of a way to share that with the community. I like to thank those of you here and online for your support of ECSU. So this is, as you know, ECSU has been a part of this community since 1891, and it wouldn't be here without the community. So I'd like to thank you for your support. Please feel free to come to our events. We have football coming up again in the fall. We haven't had football for a couple of years. So and other events on campus. So please feel free to make your way to 1704 Weeksville Road on the campus of Elizabeth City State University. And again, since we have most of the audience online, I don't want to ask a question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, kind of rhetorically. Does anybody here, if you know, raise your hand, know what picture is on the screen? Does anybody know what building that is? Yes. That, P.W. Moore. That's exactly right. But a lot of people in the audience, when they think of P.W. Moore, they think of only the elementary school that is located on Roanoke Avenue. But for most of the time that P.W. Moore has been identified as an educational institution, it actually was identified for the most part as a senior high school. In fact, when this was taken back in 1926, the building was only about 2 years old. And if you go by P.W. Moore today, you see something completely different. This building was raised in the late 1980s when the school was remodeled, and as you know now is an elementary school. But this was the original P.W. Moore. It wasn't called P.W. Moore until 1932. But the fact is that for the first couple decades of the institution's history, Elizabeth City State taught not college, university level courses, but actually taught high school and secondary education. This school ultimately replaced that. And around 1930, Elizabeth City State actually stopped offering a high school program because this school, which was called at this time Dunbar High, would become P.W. Moore in 1932. So this is the original P.W. Moore. And this is a picture that I found when I was doing research in the state archives. Lori, when she introduced my topic, she mentioned 1954 to 1969. And I was preparing for this because the topics that the name that I gave Lori was probably about 3-4 months ago, at least. As I was preparing this, I thought, you know what, it might sound like 15 years isn't a lot of time. And it's really not. But when it comes to something as volatile, and which is what this was, desegregation of schools in this region, as every other region, essentially in the South, there's simply so much to cover. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover the first 10 years, 1954 to 1964, and then I'm going to come back maybe next year and do the last 5 years, because I want to do justice to this topic, and I don't want to brush over some things that are important. And I guess if I could say that this topic today will be kind of the less bad phase. 1964 to 69 was definitely going to be very different than the first 10 years. And as we will see, hopefully we can come back next year and hear that. And again, there's a reason for that. Hold on, Lori. Lori, help me here. The arrow is not, unless I'm really as blind as I thought, the arrow is not working. I'm trying to go to a different slide. Okay. As I say, it's impossible to cover something like this in a short presentation. I mean, this is history for lunch. It's not history for all afternoon and all day. So I'm going to focus on, and I guess I like to just kind of get to the point. I'm going to have 8 key points I'm going to make. So you're easy to follow. Again, these are just 8 points. There are more out there, but again, this is a presentation that's meant to be about 30, 35, 40 minutes, because I know a lot of you have to be at work at 1 o'clock or have other plans today. The first key point, and this is something that people generally don't know. I have not heard anybody who really has told this, but if you look through the newspapers of the time, and I've read the Daily Advance back since it became the Daily Advance, and even before 1954, there were challenges to segregated education, not only in North Carolina, but in the northeastern portion of the state. Okay, people sometimes think that 1954 just happened and it just came out of nowhere, but there were challenges. The 1954 decision was based upon several other cases, and some of these cases were not specifically raised in Supreme Court, but there were challenges before 1954. In 1950, in Washington County, there was a case involving educational discrimination and segregation. People raised that. They thought it was wrong, and they opposed it. 1952 in Camden, right over the bridge here, a lawyer from Raleigh named Herman L. Taylor represented citizens, basically what they saw against inequality in the public school system. Back at this time, many times Camden school students would actually come to P.W. Moore High School, because there really wasn't, until they built Marion Anderson, a place that was for African Americans. So generally, is an African American lived in Camden, they'd have to go all the way to Elizabeth City, and so there was an issue. Okay, did I try again? Okay. The attorney Taylor actually was later on elected president of the North Carolina Lawyers Association, which was known today as the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers. So he was a very active lawyer in the civil rights movement, and he came to Camden County to represent parents who felt that their children weren't being given an adequate, equal education. And the fact is that they weren't. But they actually, by the 1950s, started to raise that issue. They became impatient with school boards who would openly violate federal law. And of course, what else has happened in mid-1954? The May 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. One thing I just want to note here, note the map. Sometimes people think that, Maryland and Delaware, they're northern states. But actually, those states had a history of segregated education. If you go to Delaware, there's the University of Delaware, and there's Delaware State. And Maryland, there are a number of HBCUs, including Maryland Eastern Shore, Bowie State, and Bethune-Cookman and such. So, but that was a major decision. And this made front page news. This was not like other school news sometimes put in the later pages of the paper. This was regarded as pivotal, major news. But one other key point is that, and sometimes people forget this too, is that just because the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was unconstitutional did not mean that the schools immediately were desegregated. The fact is that the 1954 Supreme Court decision had very little immediate impact. And there's a reason why, is that at this time, the federal government had much less of an influence in education. And again, what we know today as the Department of Education really was only regarded as the Bureau of Education, which was actually a part of the Commerce Department. The federal government was involved in education, but it didn't have the authority in 1954 that it would have later on in the 1960s, and as it has today. In other words, education was largely regarded historically under federalism as a state and local issue and not a federal issue. So the Supreme Court decision made front page news, but it did not immediately lead to tremendous changes. And what did they say? They ruled unanimously, 9-0, that segregation by race in schools was deemed unconstitutional. The 1896 separate but equal was deemed to be unconstitutional because by that point, they realized that education wasn't simply a matter of school facilities, school buildings. It was also a matter of intangible things, such as a reputation, among other things. So they realized at this point that separate but equal was impossible. And segregated education only confirmed and only guaranteed inequality. And so that's what, again, I strongly encourage you, if you have time, to actually read the decision. It's not a very long decision, but reading carefully to understand what it actually said. Another key point I want to make here is that, and this might surprise a lot of you, and it surprised me when I first learned this, but a lot of times we think that churches are by nature conservative and that they would be adamantly, completely opposed to such change. And that was true to some extent, but that's not all. In fact, when it came to Elizabeth City and came to other areas, and actually sometimes the churches and the church-related schools sometimes took the lead, while at the state level, opposition was the answer and was the response to that. The Elizabeth City Ministers Association said, and they actually made a public statement regarding the 1954 decision, said that the decision should be viewed in a framework of world peace, democratic principles, and Christian witness. And they felt that it was their duty to counsel to exercise restraint and patience and humility. And again, those of you who've been around the summer know that during the demonstrations in wake of the Andrew Brown killing, there were ministers who came to this town and made their own statements. So that might not be completely surprising. In 1954, there was something like that too. Elizabeth City Catholic schools actually desegregated in time for the fall 1954 school session. You think, really? There were once Catholic schools here in North Carolina? Absolutely. And the fact is that North Carolina was not a major state for Roman Catholicism in the 1950s, and it really isn't to this degree today. Many states have a much higher percentage of Roman Catholics than North Carolina. But there were schools in Elizabeth City, and the statewide, the Raleigh Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church actually supported desegregation, and this included even congregations. And again, there's a whole history of how the Roman Catholic Church and one bishop was very much involved and pushed the envelope. Sometimes with again, it was in many ways it didn't go very smoothly sometimes. But note that these schools were not open to non-Catholics. Okay, only the Roman Catholic schools. So they followed the federal law in 1954. But the reality is that throughout the state, the response was disappointment, was sadness, at least at the state level, at least in terms of those who were in authority, the governor, the General Assembly, and such. The Raleigh AP puts it, most Tar Heel leaders disappointed by the court's decision. The governor Olmsted was upset, and others were considered to be one of the gravest problems that has arisen in 75 years, which is a pretty strong statement to make, because that's a long time, 75 years. A lot of things are how about World War II? Okay, how about the Great Depression? I mean, wow, even bigger than that. It seems maybe a little melodramatic. I don't know. That's maybe my opinion coming in here. Now, what about the Board of Education? What about Harold Trigg, Dr. Harold L. Trigg? Many of us might know Dr. Trigg as the former president of Elizabeth City State Teachers College and the namesake of what was once the training school, which still is located across the street from Moore Hall on the campus. Harold Trigg is important historically because he was the first Black appointed to the State Board of Education back in 1949 under the governorship of W. Kerr Scott. Scott family name has gone through politics. Certainly, maybe remember Governor Bob Scott in the 60s, and then, of course, Meg Scott Whitman. I want to go there. But in any case, what was Dr. Trigg's position on it? Well, he declined to make any statement. He was, as you understand, kind of didn't want to be pushed on that. Privately, I'm certain he supported it, but he didn't want to make a public statement about it. But there's something that people also sometimes forget. The reality is that although African Americans were, in general, very strongly supportive of desegregation. The reality was, when it came to desegregation, those who were involved in education, Black teachers and Black principals, arguably had more to lose than their white counterparts. Okay, and despite that, many generally supported it anyway. And if you stay with me next year, we will talk about what happened in the late 60s when desegregation took place and how many Black teachers did not get reappointed when they combined schools. And there was some tension, and rightfully so, some tension in that. The reality was that by this point, African American teachers were on average more qualified than white teachers. They were more qualified. And one of the reasons was economically. The reality was that in America in 1954, Blacks were for the most part unable to get middle-class jobs that are now more available. Simply enough that the schools did not provide the training. There was racism in the hiring process. So in other words, one of the strongest career aspirations was a teacher, because at least there you could actually earn a middle-class income and you actually could have some kind of mobility. Whereas if you want to become an engineer or a psychologist or a social worker, those options were less limited. In other words, for African Americans, teaching wasn't just a stepping stone. It was actually a career, because middle-class occupations were, for the most part, not truly open to Blacks back in the 1950s, and would not be until later on. And so they had more to lose, and they knew that. And there was some hesitation and some concern. What was going to happen because of this? The reality is that in many ways, Black teachers sometimes earned more than whites by the 1950s, because previously in the 1940s, or actually up to about 1943, the state had actually two salary levels. Black teachers, if you were Black, this was your salary range. And if you were white, this was your salary range. And they were different. That was actually abolished by about 1943. So by 1954, Black teachers sometimes earned more than white teachers. A Black teacher, a female Black teacher who had been there for 20 years would earn more than a white teacher who had just come out of college. And the reality was that many times, again, they didn't take it as seriously as Black teachers did. And they had more experience in education, and they were now being paid more because of it. The concern was, would desegregation cost them their jobs and their careers and all that education? And again, they still supported desegregation, but there were some concerns. And there are other questions. Black schools have been effective towards upward mobility and community development. What would happen if P.W. Moore was gone? Would those benefits be gone? Some Blacks, and I say some, there were some, not a majority, a minority, but some were concerned, and some did not go support desegregation. They wanted to keep these schools around. They wanted to keep P.W. Moore around. They believed that community development was based upon that, and they feared what would happen if those schools were gone. And they didn't trust in the desegregated school system white teachers teaching their children. And then those are, again, that's a minority, but it was there. Now, another key point I'll make here is that North Carolina's approach, unlike many deep Southern states, was not to openly defy the Supreme Court's decision. Rather, their approach was to express disappointment, and they wanted to delay the implementation of the desegregation decision as long as possible. They don't want to go work on saying that we oppose the federal government, we oppose the Supreme Court, we think the Supreme Court is unjust for making this statement and mandating this. No, their approach was, if you don't like it, but to put it off and delay it. So that's what happened. That's what happened. It took 15 or more years until this decision was finally appropriately, more completely implemented. Because the reason was North Carolina's leaders didn't want to do it, and they didn't feel compelled to do it. And so they wouldn't do it. They were going to put this off as long as they could. Drag their feet. Drag their feet. The Daily Vans had and I like to look at the Daily Vans at this time because you see the changes in the newspaper, especially in the 1960s. The Daily Vans has an editorial back in June '55 desegregation is a big problem. And you see this argument a lot among whites and white newspapers, is that North Carolina has done so much for its Black schools and has done so much to equalize school facilities, and why do they want to do this? Because the schools are almost equal now. Well, they really weren't, but they didn't want to admit that. So again, what you see here is just kind of this waffling, not saying the Supreme Court was wrong, but feeling uncomfortable about it. Now, what does the Elizabeth City School Board? Now, I looked specifically at the Elizabeth City School Board papers because it was P.W. Moore that was part of Elizabeth City School Board. At this time, there were two separate school boards in this area, in this county. There was the Pasquotank County School Board, and there was the Elizabeth City School Board. They were two separate entities. They weren't united. They were two separate ones. And there have been efforts before in the past to unite them, but at this point in the 1950s, they were completely separate. The Elizabeth City School Board was more open to the changes than the Pasquotank County School Board. The Elizabeth City School Board, though, their approach was to reach out to the Black community without actually desegregating the schools. It was more or less the appearance of actually doing something without actually doing something. The same expression, the talk is cheap. And a lot of times they did a lot of talking, but they really didn't desegregate, but they wanted to be more, well, let's see what the school board says itself here. This is from the school board. This is from the minutes. Okay, this is school board minutes. Okay, during this upcoming year, the board will seek and enlist the opinions and suggestions from citizens of the community for an orderly attainment of a common objective. Notice here the focus on community and common, proceed with a prayerful deliberation to arrive at a solution which we consider most beneficial to all the children of all the people. All actions will be based upon careful and mature thought to be entirely fair to the interests of all races. I mean, this sounds great. This sounds super. I mean, common, equal, everybody involved here, and we're going to follow the law and we're going to practice good. I mean, and they said that. But did they actually desegregate the schools when this was going on? No, they didn't. There were, again, and I don't want to say that nothing was done, but there were some token changes. For example, by fall in 1955, there was an advisory committee that provided some guidance to the school board. And this committee was made up of Black members, including two famous African Americans locally in this town. Actually, we have buildings named after them. So that to me, they're pretty famous. Dr. E.O. Huffler Sr., who was actually a longtime physician here back since 1908. The number of lives he saved when he tried to help Black children get inoculations and have disease prevented. The Better Baby Clinic and such. I mean, very important stuff. And Dr. C.B. Jones Sr. Okay, Dr. C.B. Jones Sr. was ultimately going to be, as we will see this next time, the first African-American on the Elizabeth City School Board. He was a well-known dentist, and his office, I think his grandson still practices medicine right on Rose Street, right by CBS. So these were two members who were on the board. And this is important because this was the first time African-Americans were serving in any capacity of advising or leadership since around 1800. The reality was that before the 1898 white supremacy campaign in North Carolina, there actually were two kind of school committees. There was like a Black school group that helped advise Black schools, and then there was a white school group. And there actually, if you look at the minutes back in the 1890s, you will see two lists. You will see two lists. That all changed after 1900. In other words, African Americans were shut out of leadership. Whites took over control of all the schools. Black and white didn't matter. So this was important. So this was this first time for almost close to 60 years. So it was something, but it wasn't desegregation. In April 1956, for the first time, when the teachers' names were included in the minutes, and every fall they did the minutes, and that included every teacher's name that were officially going to be appointed as teachers for the next year. In the past, they were desegregated by race. They were no longer desegregated by race back in April 1956. Before, if a Black teacher were mentioned in the minutes, the person will be identified as colored. They didn't do that anymore, but they still did it by school. So P.W. Moore, every teacher there was African American, and other schools were the same way. Elizabeth City High School was obviously all white, but they didn't include, they didn't separate those anymore. Again, that's something, but it's not desegregation. In May 1959, the board approved naming the Bank Street School after Amy Jones. Amy Jones was a prominent educator who started teaching in the early 1900s. She was a graduate of Elizabeth City State Colored Normal School. Her son was also a physician, J.E. Jones. Her house used to be located on Sneed Street, next to Henry Hargrave's house, which, by the way, is still there. Her house was torn down about 10 years ago, but his house is still there. And they named the training school after Dr. Harold Trigg. So naming schools now, and again, that's something, it's something, but it's not, because this was a tactic that was not, another tactic that they used in the school. Another key point I want to make here was to improve existing Black schools, but not actually work towards desegregation. If they were interested in actually following what was now federal law, they would have been working towards a unified school, a unified high school for all. But that wasn't the approach. The approach was to improve Black schools so they were up to the level of white schools. And the thinking was, if we do that, well, then everybody's going to be happy. Okay, so that was going to be the approach the school board was going to use. And again, I'm not going to be against improving schools, but that was not really the point of the Supreme Court decision. For example, by 1959, the board was planning to spend big money on P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School. Now, this is a huge departure from the past. It wasn't until the 1940s that this school even was painted on the inside. They didn't have painted walls until the 1940s, and the school was built in the 1920s. But 1959, they're going to spend big money on the school, and they included aluminum windows and Venetian blinds. And again, if you look at the school board minutes, there's a list of expenses every year, and this one was the biggest one by far, which I don't recall seeing before. So again, they're spending money to the point where they need to improve these schools, but not build new ones that would be desegregated. And the reality was, by this point, Black schools were increasingly overcrowded. There was a serious capacity issue that hurt student learning. The reality was, by the 1940s, 1950s, there were more Black children and Black teenagers now attending high school, whereas in the old days, a lot of times Black students dropped out after the 7th grade to work because their families needed that. They didn't see education as a place to become the future. And so that was changing by the 1950s. So these schools were becoming overcrowded, seriously overcrowded and such. And it really hurt student learning. By 1963, the school board was discussing a possible new P.W. Moore High School. A new P.W. Moore High School. The Supreme Court had just said that schools desegregation was unconstitutional, and now you're building a new segregated school. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't. So the point was, well, we need to build a new school, a better school to solve the overcrowded problem, but they continually avoided the obvious question: why not build a school that is consistent with the Supreme Court's decision and make it available for everybody? But they just said no, and they just continue to, like, if we just improve this part for Black citizens, then everyone's going to be happy. But they were not following the law. I mean, this approach was destined to fail because it was a violation of federal law. It was a law of the land. The Supreme Court had ruled 9-0 that schools that were separate were by definition unequal and unconstitutional. It's impossible, the Supreme Court ruled, to have separate and equal. It's impossible. And so building new schools isn't going to solve the issue of it still remaining a separate school. Of course, the real solution would have been to build a new school for all without the extra cost of segregating students. And one thing people forget is that segregation was expensive. It was costly to have duplication. It was costly. It was kind of a waste of money. And you wonder how much money was wasted over the decades on segregated education because of duplication. And they were highly inefficient in terms of operation and such. But again, they just didn't see that. They didn't see that. Okay, another key point I want to make here, and getting near the end here because I want to do about 35 minutes and I have 12:31 here. Starting in fall '64, desegregation began. finally. Now that's over 10 years. 10 years after it was first ruled unconstitutional. Finally, segregation was going to gradually, piecemeal, step by step, baby step by baby step end. August 1964, following considerable discussion of people personnel, it was moved to reassign. And I thought about maybe not repeating the whole names here, just saying Catherine W. or William A. or Sharon L. But I didn't do that because these students were brave, and they're the ones who actually were shouldering the burden here of desegregation. So their names deserve to be mentioned. Catherine Williams was going to be assigned from P.W. Moore to Elizabeth City High. William Allen from P.W. Moore to Elizabeth City High, and Sharon Lumsden from H.L. Trigg to S.L. Sheep, now Sheep Harney. Okay, so three. In the coming months, a few white students were transferred to P.W. Moore, Carolyn Elizabeth White and Deborah Ann McCafferty. That's 2. So 3 plus 2 is 5. 5 in the entire city school district will be in. So this was desegregation that was on such a small scale. It was almost, again, numerically, almost nothing. And there's a clear problem with this approach, because who's actually shouldering the burden here? It's the students. It's the students. These were adult decisions made by adults. There were adults making decisions on the school board. And who is the one who's going to have to be the brave one going to schools where there is a climate of hostility, where there is a long history of separation, and now you're supposed to be a Black student going to a white school in which there's only like one other Black student in the entire school, and you're supposed to be going to being taught by all white teachers and all white students around you. And I mean, that must have been, back in 1964, it must have been really stressful, to say the least. And they're the ones who are doing this. They're the students are the ones who are shouldering the burden. They're the ones who are taking all the pain. They're the ones who are the anxiety, the concern, and such. They're the ones who are doing it. And the adults are simply just passing off the decision. They just don't want to accept the inevitable. The inevitable has already been stated back in 1954 in May, but they just don't want to do that. They want to just keep putting it off. And now the kids are the ones who are going to be shouldering the burden. And the final key point I want to make here is that, again, and this is why I want to end here, because the next 5 years, obviously there was a lot more desegregation, and the foot dragging was going to end. And like every other school district in the South, reality was finally here. And they could not delay the inevitable, because the inevitable was finally reality. But why did this happen? Why did it happen when it did? Well, again, I'm going to make the argument here is that it really was the November 1964 presidential election and the general election that mandated and ultimately was transformative in how this affected school desegregation. The reality was that Lyndon Johnson was a very strong candidate on the Democratic side, and Barry Goldwater was a not very popular candidate on the Republican side, and it was a landslide. It was a landslide that was simply no way to put it other than a landslide. And the Democrats had large majorities in the Senate and the House, and they had the executive office. And as a result of that, there was legislation, including, of course, the Civil Rights Act and other laws that pertain to education that were going to be put in place. So one major effect of this election was now the federal government was going to be involved in school desegregation, whether the state of North Carolina or Delaware or Maryland or South Carolina or Georgia or Florida or Louisiana or Tennessee or Mississippi or Arkansas or Alabama, like it or not. Okay. And then they had the power, and the federal law is going to be shaped. And so now in the next 5 years, you're going to see some revolutionary change in schools in Elizabeth City and elsewhere. And so the delay was going to come to an end. But I'll save that for 2022. Okay, that's 12:35, that's 12:36. So, all right, questions? Yes. Sure. Okay. Yes. Mhm. Uh-huh. Okay. That actually, that I'm probably going to mention that in my next talk about how we ultimately had teachers that were being transferred and how that was and such. Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you. So you lived it. Yes. Yes. Yes, actually, that was earlier on here. Let me see here. This was Catherine Williams from P.W. Moore to Elizabeth City High and William Allen. Those are the two ones. These are the first ones. Now, there obviously will going to be more in the years to come. No, these are students. A pupil, considering of this pupil personnel. Now, Catherine Williams was a student. Catherine Williams was a student. I met her. She came to one of my earlier talks a number of years ago, if I recall correctly. If I recall correctly, not as sharp as I used to be. Yes. 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 Okay. So they had some time. So they were not seniors ready to graduate. They still had a couple of years of high school left. Yes. Yeah, I remember the Daily Advance had done a story. They've done a number of stories on P.W. Moore High School and such. And why did I do this topic is I work on a number of projects at school when I'm not teaching. And I'm doing one this fall on football, Elizabeth City State football. And I'm doing something on the 1960s sit-ins. This one is one of those projects I've been working on for years, and I'm still working on it. But it's come up in that. And so the Daily Advance has done a number of stories on P.W. Moore High and students and interview students. And I appreciate that because those are some really good oral interviews, at least what's in there and such. And I also know that there is a woman did a dissertation on P.W. Moore High School back about less than 10 years ago. And it's out there. And she interviewed students who went to P.W. Moore and such. So this has come up in my research, and I'm going to probably eventually get to this a lot more than I have. But I've actually gone back to after the Civil War, to the Freedmen's Bureau schools and such. So anyway, any other questions?
We have a question. How were the students selected?
How were the students selected? I do know that in the past, again, I'm not going to say specifically how Catherine Williams and William Allen were selected. I do know that in the past, parents, the way it worked is parents would actually solicit the school board and request that students be placed. So that it would have to come from the parents. The school board would be the one to either accept or decline. And this issue became a lot more after 64 because there was something called the freedom of choice. The way North Carolina was finally going to respond to federal law was something called freedom of choice. And so they were going to let parents, they will be a lot more liberal in terms of allowing parents to say, I want my kid to go to this school. And so that was another foot dragging approach because it still said, hey, it's not our fault. The parents don't want it, so don't ask us to do it. But generally it came from the parents. I understand the parents would have to be on board with it. And in the past, And I would say that if you look at other school districts throughout the South, a lot of times parents would actually try to have their children placed in white schools, and they were rejected. This is back in the 50s or so. That's how some looked upon it, as we were protesting segregation by asking the school board to actually place our child in this other school. And the school board said no, then they would have recourse. Hey, you're breaking the law. You're breaking the law. So are you saying that the Zoom audience is actually being able to hear this?
Yes, sir. And
oh, that's good.
We actually have another comment. I think that was right. Parents were the ultimate determination of who attended school.
Yeah. From my understanding, again, it's like, this is one of those topics I've been working on off and on for a number of years, and my memory is not quite as fresh as it was. But I'm hoping before I retire to actually have this published as a book. And I can see it in my head, but I only have, look at my time and what else I like to do. And sometimes an issue of what you want to get done and the time to do it. And I'm not, no, we're hope for the best. Other comments from other questions? Okay, well, thank you for spending your lunch hour here listening, learning about some history. Laura, you have anything you want to talk about future presentations? Upcoming presentation?
So we do, if you are interested in future presentations, History for Lunches, we have our program calendar, or you can visit the museum's Facebook page. But for the month of July, we're only having one History for Lunch. And in August, we'll have our next one on the first Wednesday of the month. If you still prefer to join us virtually, they will be offered through Zoom, or you can join us in person. We would be delighted to have you. As you can see, we're having our History for Lunches in the auditorium. So if you prefer to social distance, you should be able to social distance in our auditorium. Thank you, Dr. Bowman, for joining us today, and thank you for joining us virtually and in person. Thank you.